Assalamualaikum and salam sejahtera. Welcome to Let's Talk, where we discuss current and evolving matters of foreign policy and international affairs. Today's topic is forging ahead in the post-pandemic, focusing on revitalizing Malaysia's link to the global economy. For the past years, the unprecedented scale of COVID-19 has taken the world by surprise and continue to disrupt livelihoods. As the global economy emerged from the disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic, attention is turning towards growth prospects. In this context, where does Malaysia stand and where do we go from here? To discuss this matter further, we are privileged to have two distinguished panelists with us today. First, we have Mr. Surendran Satasivam. Mr. Surendran Satasivam is the Director of Macroeconomics Division at the Economic Planning Unit, EPU. He has been involved in Malaysia's economic policy planning for more than 20 years. He has been instrumental in various international negotiations, including at ASEAN-level meetings. He holds a Master's in International Economics and Development Studies from the University of Sofia, Tokyo, Japan. Thank you for sparing the time with us today, Mr. Surendran. Next, allow me to introduce Datuk Dr. A.T. Kumaraja, member of the Economic Action Council, EAC. EAC is the highest advisory body to the government, tasked to drive the nation's sustainable economic growth and to ensure inclusive socio-economic development. Datuk Kumaraja is an expert in the field of pharmaceutical and healthcare technology. He is the Treasurer General of National Chambers of Commerce and Industry, as well as Honorary Secretary General for Malaysian Associated Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Thank you for joining us today, Datuk. It's a great honor to have you here today. And my name is Mardia Sabri, and I will be moderating today's discussion. As we know, COVID-19 has unraveled not only as a global public health crisis, but also a global economic crisis. On top of that, the Ukraine-Russia conflict and other geopolitical events have also triggered economic uncertainties. How has the economic landscape changed, considering the recent global health and geopolitical developments? Perhaps we could begin with Mr. Surendran.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. First of all, I would like to thank IDFR on behalf of Economic Planning Unit to invite me as one of the panelists. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with the other fellow panelists, Dr. A.T. Kumaraja. Okay, to answer your question, the pandemic has impacted the global economy in 2020. As we look at the growth, which declined from 3.2% compared to a growth of 2.8% in 2019. All sectors were significantly affected, especially the services sectors related to tourism and aviation. This has led to an increase in global unemployment and poverty. The World Bank has estimated that there has been an increase in the number of global hardcore poor, with an additional 97 million people falling into poverty in 2020. Malaysia has not been spared by the impact of the pandemic. Looking back at our performance during the 11th Malaysia Plan from 2016 to 2020, the gross domestic product GDP grew at an average rate of 2.7% per annum, lower than the 11th plan target. This was mainly due to the contraction of 5.5% of GDP in 2020, despite having a higher growth of 4.9% per annum the first 4 years of the 11th Malaysia Plan. The gross national income, the GNI per capita, reached 42,500 ringgit Malaysia, or $10,100 in 2020. This is a 20% below the income threshold to achieve a high income nation status. Malaysia had to deal with the health and economic crisis. The government's financial position was affected due to an urgent need to protect lives and livelihoods. Our fiscal space is very limited. The fiscal deficit has widened to 6.2% to GDP in 2020, and the federal government statutory debt was at 57.9% to GDP. Maybe I stopped here, and then I will let Datuk. to continue.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Mr. Surendran. Datuk Kumaraja, perhaps you'd like to add your thoughts on this.
Sure, I think Mr. Surendran already mentioned everything in terms of the statistics, so we more or less understand. But as a businessman, what I understand is what COVID has done, it's primarily brought our economic growth where we are back in 2018, which is basically what he summed up in terms of the negative growth. So in 2020, 2021, we are back where we started in 2018. That's one. Second, I think the whole COVID experience has, while we don't have a narrative, we didn't have a playbook, but I think our government, considering everything else, being a middle income nation who's trying to grow, we are neither here nor there, we are not a slow growing economy, we are not a giant, but we are somewhere in between. I think that has also given us a very sweet spot, and we have done well. Despite, I think Mr. Surendran mentioned we had a economic issue, we had a health issue, but I think we also had a political issue. I think that's the biggest thing, because that political issue, despite the political unrest or the instability, we have changed 2 prime ministers in the whole same COVID period, 3 prime ministers, and we have still done very, very well. So I think the government's institutions, the financial institutions, our banks are well capitalized, the markets are well capitalized, and I think even the consumers, as Malaysians, we have done very well, because our vaccination rates are very, very high, despite we not being a vaccine producing country. Our healthcare system, yes, we had a kink, but I think the private healthcare system complemented our work, and I think we've been able to deliver the best bang for the buck. So everything else being equal, I think as a nation we have done very, very well in terms of health, in terms of economy, and I think even in terms of positioning our country, including the recent US-ASEAN summit. I think in many of these international arenas, we have been able to find our sweet spot. I think overall, I think well done to Malaysia.
Thank you, Datuk Kumaraja. So on that positive note, Datuk, since the onset of pandemic, Malaysia has responded early and swiftly to keep markets open, especially in the crucial economic sectors such as manufacturing. But considering Malaysia's linkages to the global value chain, how has this impacted business and investment environment in Malaysia? What are your thoughts, Datuk?
Again, I think we, in the beginning, like you said, we didn't have a narrative, right? So I still remember in the early days, March 18th, when the first MCO was announced, nobody said it was a lockdown, but I think everybody understood it was being a lockdown. But I think we were grappling with the idea of life versus livelihood. I think that was one big discussion. Life versus livelihood, flatten the curve. These were all the hashtags which were very prominent then, right? So flatten the curve, kita jaga kita, life versus livelihood. And eventually, I think MITI was grappling with the idea of what's essential and what's not essential. And then we came up with a list of what's essential, and you said, okay, look, bread is essential. Yeah, but nobody figured out that the logistics, the supply chain, the plastics that need to be produced to wrap that bread, and that gum that needs to be put on the wrapper is also essential. So for us to even find what is this supply chain essentials took us nearly 2 years. So in many ways, I think we as a nation have learned from COVID experience, the COVID pandemic, is the granular data. And I can quote, say, the micro Grant Khas Prihatin micro, which was given out to close to 1 million micro enterprises, and I think we spent close to about 6 billion ringgit or something in that extent, 3,000 per micro enterprise. Today, LHDN has got data set of all these million micro SMEs. The word micro SME itself was only coined during the pandemic. If you go back to see how SMEs have been always quoted, it was always SMEs, and micros are part and parcel of it. It is only in the era of pandemic that we actually coined the word micro, and today we say MSMEs. So in many ways, I think the pandemic has brought out the granular data, and even within the government sector today we have good data set which can be used both in terms of incentives, in terms of programs, and in terms of where we are. And if you look at manufacturing, right, so I remember there was this lot of discussion, and I think even the social media discussion was, why are we allowing export markets, export industries, manufacturing industries to be open when some of the service industries were closed? I think the argument is simply because we are part of the global supply chain. If I remember numbers right, I think even in the semiconductor industry, we occupy 5% of the global supply chain. So if you close down any of this manufacturing that's going into that supply chain, I think we are going to have a widespread issue. Second, in a time when there is a war-like situation, I think we as a nation must be able to get the fastest industries up and running. So the export markets were there, which is what was giving us that growth in 2021. I think it was, if not for the export markets, we wouldn't have been able to register the kind of growth that EPU is speaking about now. So it was a good decision. In hindsight, I think we have done well.
Thank you, Dato. Let's talk about economic development, particularly at the national level. The global health and economic crisis has unveiled the fundamental vulnerabilities in our economies and societies, from weaknesses in our social protection and health systems to the digital divide. The vulnerable groups and sectors which are reliant on travel and tourism, micro, small and medium enterprises, MSMEs, have been more adversely affected by the pandemic compared to others. Mr. Surendran, can you share Malaysia's national approach towards ensuring a more equitable and inclusive economic development? Please, Mr. Surendran.
The 12th Malaysia Plan, we supposed to table the 12th Malaysia Plan in Parliament in 2020 because it is a socio-economic development plan, and this plan is supposed to be implemented during 2021 to 2025. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to delay the tabling of this 12th Malaysia Plan in Parliament. So we end up tabling the 12th Malaysia Plan on the 27th September 2021 in Parliament. So what we did actually in 2020, our work actually started from April 2019, and we supposed to table 12th Malaysia Plan in 2020. But because of the pandemic, we had to redo our consultation, the engagement with the stakeholders, to come up with the strategies, initiatives, and also plan of actions that will address the impact of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So the 12th Malaysia Plan 2021-2025 is actually aims to address current issues and at the same time to restart and rejuvenate Malaysia's socio-economic development for long-term sustainability and prosperity. It sets the foundation to realize the spirit of Keluarga Malaysia, which will propel national development over the next 5 years to achieve a prosperous, inclusive and sustainable Malaysia. It is also a major agenda for national recovery to restore the economic stability of the rakyat as well as holistically regenerate and reinvigorate national economic growth. It had been formulated based on bottom-up approach where voices of all stakeholders have been given due consideration. We had more than 600 engagement sessions. The 12th plan outlines 3 themes, 4 policy enablers and 14 game changers altogether. The themes are resetting the economy, the first theme. Second theme will be strengthening security, well-being and inclusivity. And then the third will be advancing sustainability. To support these 3 themes, we have 4 policy enablers, which are the developing future talent, accelerating technology adoption and innovation, enhancing connectivity and transport infrastructure, as well as strengthening the public service. Game changers, the 14 game changers that have been outlined in the 12th Malaysia Plan is very important because they represent bold and innovative actions that are very important to shift the mindsets and change the approach to national development. So among the game changers, I just want to focus on 2 game changers, which are the game changer number 2 that talks about catalyzing strategic and high impact industries to boost economic growth. If in the 11th Malaysia Plan, we have mentioned about high impact industries that include 3 from the manufacturing subsectors, electric and electronics, manufacturing and equipment, chemical and chemical products, and 2 other high growth performance industry that are aerospace and medical devices. But for the 12th Malaysia Plan, there are 8 strategic and high impact industries being identified. These include advanced E&E, electrical and electronic, halal industry, creative industry, aerospace industry, global services, tourism industry, biomass industry, and also smart farming. That is on Game Changer 2. And talking about Game Changer 6, transforming the approach in eradicating hardcore poverty. Here, if we talk about poverty, we have to look at the B40. So we have about 2.91 million household in Malaysia, which earns less than 4,850 ringgit Malaysia. So they are categorized under B40. And you also have absolute poor, who are about 405,441 households in Malaysia. They are earning less than 2,208 ringgit Malaysia per month household. And the hardcore poor, who are earning less than 1,169 per month per household, and there are about 27,158. So when we mention about transforming the approach, we cannot be doing the same approach that one size doesn't fit all. So you have to have a targeted approach whereby you go to the ground, you identify the hardcore poor, then you have a specific programs that will be tailor-made for them, to bring them out from the hardcore poor, the household income that I mentioned just now, which is less than 1,169. So basically, if you talk about one household, they will have like a husband and wife and 2 children. So the per capita will be about 300 per person. So at least you have to cover 300 ringgit Malaysia per person. So these are the initiatives that have been taken up by Economic Planning Unit, and we are working together with even at the local authorities level, the state government level, and of course with the implementation and coordination unit, our sister agency under the Prime Minister's Department. And if you look at the more than 500 pages of the 12th Malaysia Plan, we have set targets. So these targets, if you look at each chapter, we have 13 chapters altogether. We have set targets that we need to achieve during the 5-year span. Okay. If you talk about prosperity, we are talking about GDP growth, that we say that we have to achieve a GDP growth rate of 4.5% and between 4.5% and 5.5% per annum during the 5-year span. And then if you talk about inclusivity, we say that we are trying to get the average monthly household income, the target monthly household income at about 10,000 ringgit Malaysia by 2025. And we have this disparity among the regions. So the gap in GDP per capita between the central region and Sabah, for instance, to be reduced to 1 to 2.5. And if you talk about sustainability, so in the 12th Malaysia Plan, we are not talking about prosperity and inclusivity alone. We are also emphasizing on sustainability, the environment part, which one of the key goals will be reduction in the greenhouse gases emissions intensity by 4.5% to GDP by 2030, based on emissions intensity in 2030. And we always say that we have a very great, excellent plans. But what are more important is the implementation part. So we, for the past plans, we already have this, the policy implementation plan, or we call it Plan Pelaksanaan Dasar, PPD, which we will circulate to all the ministries and agencies right after we table our 5-year plan. And this is actually to provide as a guideline, for policy implementation at the national level, and contains comprehensive action plans outlined in the Malaysia plans. Something extra that we have done for the 12th Malaysia Plan is we have set up one special monitoring committee, and this special monitoring committee is chaired none other by our own Prime Minister. So he wants to monitor the implementation of the 12th Malaysia Plan. And this is very important, because I think even private sector, when they come to us, they say, yes, you have a very great plan, 12th Malaysia Plan is very great, but how are you going to monitor them? So the Prime Minister himself is monitoring the plan. So this is very important to make sure that all the initiatives, the strategies that we already outlined under the 12th Malaysia Plan is achieved. So this is how we want to not only to cover the prosperity part, and also the inclusivity and the sustainable dimensions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Surendran, for that very comprehensive views on our national economic development plan. Thank you for the insightful and comprehensive discussion by our panelists. We will now take a break and stay tuned to the next session of Let's Talk, Forging Ahead in the Post-Pandemic. Welcome back to Let's Talk. For those of you just tuning in, today's discussion is focused on revitalizing Malaysia's link to the global economy. We were discussing equitable, inclusive and sustainable economic development at the national level, where Mr. Surendran has shared on the development and implementation mechanism of RMK12. Datuk Kumaraja, perhaps you'd like to share your view on this.
Actually, I wanted to, I think if you look at the national approach, one of the things that the private sector really was surprisingly, happy was during the announcement of the second stimulus package. So the government has done very, very well. The first stimulus package was announced before the PKP, which was in the end of February under Tun Mahathir. So when Tun Mahathir announced it, I think it was $20 billion. And after that, when Tan Sri Muhyiddin became Prime Minister, he announced a second stimulus package. And in that whole era of pandemic, we have announced 8 stimulus packages, totaling about $550 billion, with about $90 billion actually being fiscal stimulus injection. And one of the biggest things that stood out from this is what we did for the wage subsidy program. I think we did about 4 rounds of it, and until end of this year, I think in some of the sectors it's still going on until June this year. I think we would have done very, very well, because our unemployment rate, we had full employment, below 3%, and now we had just over 4% plus. We are close to 800,000 people who are probably out of a job. But we would have had a lot more if the government didn't spend 20 billion ringgit, which was direct cash injection towards about 350,000 employers and saving close to 2.5 million jobs. If not, we would have had unemployment and riots on the street. So to me, I think as a national approach, the government has done very well and reverberated to what the private sector wanted. Because what was hard in the private sector in the times of pandemic, at least in the early stages when nothing was open, was how do we pay salaries? So we came up with a very good system. I wouldn't think it has solved everybody's problem, but at least we took a median approach and says, look, we will pay that 600 ringgit and eventually that 1,002, because that was the median pay. So that was a very good approach, and that saved a lot of people, a lot of companies from going down. If not, there was zero revenue. And how do you pay salaries? So that one big, I think, big bang approach, 20% of our GDP, something we as a nation must be very, very proud, because no country with that kind of fiscal space to move, despite keeping some sort of a fiscal discipline, managed to do that kind of stimulus. Plus the moratorium. Regardless of whether you're a businessman or whether you're a wage earner or whether you're a government servant, I think that moratorium 2 times in that whole 20 months was something which was never happened even in more developed economies. And despite that, our banking systems are very intact. So I think that's another big move. If I from the private sector, wage subsidy program and the moratorium, 2 most highest impact programs that has ever really been done in the pandemic approach by the government. I think that again goes to show that there is some resilience in the system, and we must be proud of those things.
So, thank you, Dato'. I think we all can agree and be proud of our national response towards COVID. It symbolized our resilience and our strive to forge ahead in the post-pandemic.
Yes.
So moving on to the next questions. In this current economic environment that is increasingly volatile to external shocks, some countries have resorted to protectionism and sanctions at the expense of international cooperation. How would this economic environment impact Malaysia's economy? Perhaps Mr. Surendran would like to comment first?
Yeah, the global growth is expected to slow significantly from 6.1% in 2021 to 3.6% in 2022. Of course, largely due to the consequence of the Ukraine-Russia war. This crisis actually unfolds while the global economy was on a recovery path and yet to fully recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to the war, we also saw this slowdown in China's economy, whereby frequent and wider ranging lockdown in China, including in key manufacturing hubs, have also slowed activities there and could cause new bottlenecks in global supply chain. And a tightening of monetary policy in many countries due to persistent price pressure. This has actually took us to an overall risk to economic prospects which rise sharply, and policy trade-offs have become ever more challenging. The economic effects of the war are spreading far and wide, mainly through commodity markets, trade and financial linkages. Because Russia is a major supplier of oil, gas and metals, and together with Ukraine, they produce wheat and corn, the current and anticipated decline in the supply of these commodities has already driven prices up sharply. Although bottlenecks are expected to eventually ease as production elsewhere responds to higher prices and new capacity becomes operational, supply shortages in some sectors are expected to spill over into 2023. As a result, inflation is now projected to remain elevated for much longer in both advanced and emerging market and developing economies. There are several downside risks to the global outlook. These include prolonged Russia-Ukraine war, escalation of sanctions on Russia, a sharper than anticipated deceleration in China following strict zero COVID strategy, and renewed flare-up of the pandemic should a new, more virulent virus strain emerge. Now we are hearing about head, foot, mouth disease in Malaysia, and also monkeypox. So other external headwinds to growth include interest rate hikes. We have seen our own OPR has been increased from 1.75% to 2% now. Geopolitical tension in Sri Lanka, risk of a debt crisis, financial market volatility. Due to these external headwinds, the domestic economy is expected to experience some pressure from supply chain disruption, rising cost and increasing cost of living. We have done our own analysis on the impact of Russia-Ukraine war on Malaysia. So if we look at the economic impact of this Russia-Ukraine crisis on Malaysia, it is expected to be very minimal. Why? Because we have a limited direct trade links with these countries. The share of Malaysia's total trade with Russia and Ukraine in 2021 only at 0.4% and 0.07% respectively. In terms of investment, both countries are marginal source of foreign direct investment, FDI, in Malaysia, with less than 0.01 billion ringgit Malaysia, which is about 10 million ringgit, out of the total 796.3 billion ringgit Malaysia. Industrialized economies, including Malaysia, will likely to take a hit if there is an outbreak of war due to trade disruption. And we also look at the panic and flight to safety among investors will likely to happen, causing capital outflows from emerging markets amid global risk aversion. And inflation pressure could be further complicated if escalating tensions and sanctions result in energy supply disruptions and potentially worsen already burdened shipping and supply chains. But whatever it is, the economic impact of this Russian-Ukraine crisis in Malaysia is expected to be very minimal. The same thing, the impact of India's ban on wheat export. So when we look at the ban of India's ban on wheat exports with effect from 13 May 2022 to Malaysia, the total imports of wheat from India during January-March 2022 was 37.3 million, or only 4.2% of total wheat imports of Malaysia. We sourced wheat from Australia, United States and Canada, whereby they are the main exporter of wheat to Malaysia, with total exports recorded at 738.4 million ringgit, or 83.5% during the same period. In 2021, India was the 18th largest wheat exporters to the world, with total value of $0.4 billion US dollar, or 0.8% of total world exports. And when we talk about the impact of Indonesia's ban on palm oil exports, it's actually a gain to Malaysia, because Malaysia is expected to gain from Indonesia's palm oil export ban effectively from 28 April 2022, as palm oil importers will shift their demand from Indonesia to Malaysia. And the drastic move implemented by Indonesia is expected to increase export demand for Malaysian palm oil. Malaysia is the world's second largest palm oil exporter, with total exports valued recorded at 9.8 billion ringgit Malaysia, or 31.3% of total world exports in 2020. In 2021, the economy expanded by 3.1%, reflecting a continued recovery trajectory, supported mainly by the policy support, improvement in domestic demand, and robust export performance. As Malaysia enters the endemic phase, during the first quarter of 2022, the economy registered a strong growth of 5%, driven by strong domestic demand, supported by continued normalization of economic activities in line with the easing of containment measures. The economy is expected to accelerate further by between 5.3% and 6.3% in 2022. This is an official figure announced by Bank Negara Malaysia, with growth to be underpinned by stronger external demand and higher private and public expenditure. The headline inflation to average between 2.2% and 3.2% in 2022. The latest CPI figure was announced yesterday. The CPI figure is at 2.3% in April 2022 compared to 2.2% amid higher underlying inflation. And if we talk about the labour market, the conditions are expected to improve gradually as economic activity picks up, with the unemployment rate expected to decline further to around 4% of the labour force. We had full employment since 1992, with the exception of 2022, where the unemployment was at 4.5%. The highest was at 5.3% May 2020, and 2021 it registered about 4.6%. All these growth rates that I mentioned is also in line with the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which estimated Malaysia's economy to grow by 5.6% in 2022. The IMF projected the headline inflation to grow at 3% in 2022. And the opportunities, when we talk about opportunities to the economy, to the domestic economy, it will be underpinned by the positive contribution, especially from the global semiconductors demand, whereby now we are having a upcycle in the semiconductors market. Firm commodity prices, we have seen high market, what we call that, prices of crude oil, since we are net exporter, and the palm oil prices as well. Export-led manufacturing activities in terms of petroleum and chemicals, as well as E&E products. Consumer and business sentiments are very good, and we look at the business tendency statistics in the first quarter of 2022, it rebounded to 7.6%. It was at negative 0.3% during the fourth quarter, and 21.3%, negative 21.3% during the third quarter of 2021. This is first ever increase in business optimism compared to the previous 9 quarters. And of course, the reopening of the borders since 1st April 2022, the stimulus package, like what Dato' Kumararaja mentioned just now, the budget 2022 with 8 stimulus packages worth 530 billion, including direct fiscal injection of 91.8 billion ringgit, and also the 12th Malaysia Plan, better COVID-19 management, strong FDIs, especially in manufacturing, services and financial services sector. During the first quarter of 2022, FDI registered net inflow of 24.4 billion ringgit Malaysia. We registered only 18.5 billion ringgit Malaysia in fourth quarter of 2021. Thereby, it shows the global investors' confidence in Malaysia as an attractive investment destination. And recently, I think the US Trade Mission announced by the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, they have secured investment commitment of about 16.52 billion ringgit Malaysia investment, which they target that this will be carried out in the third quarter of 2022. Companies like Insulate, Ferrotech, Amazon Web Services Incorporated. So these are the investments that we can expect to come in 2022 and also in 2023. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Surendran, thank you. You also raised a very good point that relates back to what Datuk Kumarja has already shared, because one actions or there's a domino effect in the global chain, and that despite the portrayal of gloom and doom, it's very relieving to see that we are actually on the upward trajectory. So Datuk Kumarja, in your view, how could diplomacy play a more significant role in Malaysia's economic growth?
I think Mr. Surendran has, gone through a very lengthy, near economic report level, right? So that's like sitting through the budget
and recent numbers
only in October, November, but then now he has a prelude to it. But let's look at the optics, right? So whether it is the pandemic phase or post-pandemic, just after the US ASEAN summit just a week ago, one of the big pictures that is really making around social media rounds is with President Jokowi and Elon Musk. And everybody, obviously Malaysians being Malaysians, we tend to ask this question and says, look, Malaysia has lost out huge investments, and obviously everything has moved to Indonesia, and because it's moved to Indonesia, why is Malaysia lost out? And I think we as a nation, sometimes we have very short memory, because we have actually done very well. If you look at the 2021 numbers, we have done 2.5 times better than we did in 2020. We have the single largest investment of $40 billion in an investment which has come through in the state of Kedah. We don't speak about the positive things. Obviously, when you talk about the Detroit of Southeast Asia, then it's either Thailand or Indonesia that any of the auto manufacturing guys will move to. But doesn't mean if Elon Musk alone has moved to Indonesia, means we have lost out. Because we have done very well. That 16 billion is a case in point. Second, we as a nation also don't want to do everything. We have evolved from export intensive, labor intensive economy to now a high income thriving economy. We're looking at digital space, we're looking at digital economy, looking at IR 4.0 and stuff like this. So when we start pegging those things, I think we should go back to the idea that we should probably become better in a few areas. In terms of whether it is automation, semiconductor, we are still there, electronic and electrical products, we're still there, export oriented markets, we're still there, and maybe as a nation we also should stop looking at this labor intensive stuffs. Obviously Vietnam is the most sexiest place. I won't even think it's up and coming, it's already there. But you give Vietnam another 10 years, they also will be out of people who willing to work at a low wages. So when that happens, this shift will happen, because global economy, global multinational companies will move very, very fast. We should take advantage of the space that we are, which is in automation, which is in IR 4.0, and even this high knowledge economy. And that's where I think we as a nation have got good point. Talking about some of the other policy responses we had, you asked about earlier our global link and what's really happening in Russian-Ukraine war. Maybe as an economic impact we don't have very, very high, but you see how we have responded. Never before we have taken off APs. This idea of APs, again, whether it is, I'm not sure whether elections are around the corner, but the whole idea of taking off APs is a policy response that has never been done before. But this is what Tun did when he pegged the ringgit to US dollars. That was unprecedented. Taking out APs is again unprecedented. We have taken out APs 4+1, so 5 items, right? So that will take care of the immediate short-term supply side issue. What we have is a supply side issue. We don't have enough chickens in the market. Yeah. So as long as any importer be able to source, I remember, I'm sure I can quote this because it's not an economic thing. I saw Dr. Wira Maidin, very good friend of ours, who's actually now on the way to somewhere in Vietnam or Thailand to try to source out chicken. He says it's cheaper there. I'm not sure whether it's come back, but I'm sure he comes back with a lot of chicken. So in that way, that policy response we have taken is very good. But it shouldn't be specified timeline. Again, we tend to give subsidies. We have given 525 million, if I'm not mistaken, by until end of June to poultry farming, 60 cents per kilo. But what I think we shouldn't do is keep it open-ended. We should say, look, we give subsidy, but when the market stabilizes, we stop. We have not done that in oil subsidy, and I think Tunku Zafrul has gone on record and said you spend $100 odd billion in terms of subsidy, because the guys who still run the BMW is getting subsidy. Why should that happen in our nation? So in that way, I think as a policy response, Malaysia has taken a very agile position. It is not all well, but I think as policy responses, I think government has done well again. I mean, again from the private sector, all we want is to be able to do business in a fair and a competitive space. And taking off APs is one very good thing. It allows the market to stabilize. And eventually, but we cannot have this open-ended, because once we have it open-ended, then we're going to have this anti-dumping thing happening at some point in time, where countries will be able to produce it at a very, very low cost because they have economics of scale. When they start dumping it, what happens to our local domestic agro-food industries? Those guys are going to suffer because they have never been able to produce the food that we need in that scale or cost that the international players with much larger land space have been able to do. So in that way, we have a moral obligation towards our domestic industry, but we'll have to stabilize prices now. So we should take a very agile approach. It has done well, and we hope that in the months and years to come, government will be able to play that stabilizing role, and that's very good in terms of policy response. I think we, private sector, welcome that.
Thank you, Datuk. That's definitely something that we can look forward to, like the recovery and the positive after effect of this. You touched on high value, IR 4.0 and digitalization, Datuk. So the pandemic has accelerated digitalization to become an integral part of economies and businesses. So hence, in your opinion, Datuk, is it a threat or an opportunity for the global economy? If you can elaborate more on this.
I think, I mean, if any readings, right? So anyway, I think this is just, now digital economy is the most easiest thing to say, and nobody really understands what's happening. But if you look at what has happened is, what should have happened in 5 years has happened in 5 months, right? It's because that acceleration was no more supply side, it was demand driven. If our meetings never moved to Zoom, if our food never moved to Grab, if our banking never moved digital, we have got 5 new digital banking licenses. So if this shift was not because of the demand side, it is because it was more like threatened because of the COVID pandemic, and companies had to pivot. And if you see the numbers that has come out, Google has just published a week ago, written in Singapore, and where they say the number of digital consumers in our country has increased 4.5 times. And the number of digital merchants has nearly doubled, which simply means whether you like it or not, even the small mom and pop shop has been forced to go digital, whether it is in the touch and go payment, or whether it is your digital payment, or whether in terms of merchandise, or whether in terms of using food delivery systems for the restaurants. So whichever way, I think this shift has made things better. And I think in that way, Malaysian companies have also gone on to realize that the market size is no more limited to these 32 billion people that we have in our 32 million people that we have in our nation. Because I again quote some numbers, because I've got the EPU Sifu sitting next to me, so I must quote the numbers also. If you take ASEAN, and if you look at the 15 trade agreements that Malaysia has got, that 15 trade agreements plus our country, we're already talking about 4 billion population, right? So that's a huge population size. If we even talk about what's really happening now, the RCEP. So RCEP covers 1/3 of the population, 1/3 of the global GDP, and that's a huge market. And now, fine, RCEP is China-centric. Then we start talking about what US has come up with in terms of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and that Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is 10 plus 2 countries, right? So that alone brings about another opportunity for trade and commerce for our nation. So we as a nation, I think, should be very, very optimistic in terms of how we have responded. And if you're talking about digital shift, everything that has been happening, so if I had to quote policy documents, is the Malaysian digital blueprint, which was launched last year. I think goes all the way up to 2030, and also the National Economic E-commerce Roadmap 2.0, which quotes that we will be able to shift or digitalize about 875,000 micro SMEs, create 500,000 jobs, invest $70 billion, out of which $21 billion goes into infrastructure under the Jendela program. Increasing broadband penetration alone by 10 percentage point increases GDP by 1.38% in our nation. That's what OECD number says. So which primarily means the whole idea of why government is pushing for 5G digitalization, we don't have to talk about the merits or whether it should be done under Digital National or whether it should be done by the telco companies themselves. I think that's a different argument altogether. But the whole idea of 5G would make our economy grow faster by at least 1.3% time. So that really will achieve the numbers that we need. And we have gone big, one of the few smaller countries that have gone very big in terms of 5G investment. And I think that's another way where digital investment is here to stay. And I think even as consumers, they have shifted the whole idea of, we are so used to doing things like online that the future we will see convergence of the physical and the digital or the virtual world. Augmented physical realities are not very, very far away. Those days we see something on 2D and order. Now you actually can feel it and eventually order. So that's the economy that we're moving first. We are agnostic in terms of technology. I think the small companies don't have to worry much because they don't have to worry. It is not technology. What's scaring actually small companies, and then if you look at the downside, many people say, look, not many Malaysian companies have adopted digital space. We only got less than 30% of our companies having websites. But those are all work in progress. And I think we as a nation, we don't have to be worried about technology. All we have to be worried about using that technology to pivot our business. And that, I think government has taken very good initiatives under MDEC and the related agencies. And we hope in the next years to come, that acceleration for our economy will come from the digital space, because we're growing twice faster in the digital space than we can grow in the physical space. So I think it is an opportunity, cannot be a threat.
Yeah, cannot be a threat. There's something
except for tax collections. That one I leave it to them, how to do it.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we can agree on, I think. So moving on, I believe we have time to take some questions from the floor. So I open the floor to questions, and also please introduce your name before asking your questions.
Hi, my name is Adib, and my question will be for Dato' Kumaraja. So Dato', nowadays we see a number of mega projects that has been going on, for example like CRL, Merdeka Tower, and also there's been a plan to revive the high-speed rail project with Singapore. Considering the current economic situation and what is awaiting ahead, shouldn't the government pay more attention to curbing, or if not slowing down, the global the impact of the global economic situation instead? Thank you.
Okay, that's a good question for a politician. But if you ask me a private sector guy, I think government can, if government wants to invest in mega projects, actually is beneficial to us, right? Because a lot of multiplier effect in the economy happens, right? Simply because if you take the construction industry, everything that you mentioned is nearly infrastructure based, whether it's the ECRL or whether it's the Merdeka Tower, but I think it's already up, nearly up, right? And even the high speed rail, I don't know whether it is in Singapore being revived, now you're speaking one towards even the north, to Bangkok or somewhere. So any infrastructure project has got a multiplier effect. If I'm not mistaken, EPU has counted like 1 to 3. But your idea of like, shouldn't we manage the short-term issues? But I think there shouldn't be a trade-off. We should continue to invest in the long-term projects, because these are things that will bring us benefits in the medium to long term. It's a question of phasing out this, whether those investments should be done today or whether it should be done in the next 4 to 5 years. Managing the long-term impacts, because if we to trade off that, while we can put our house together now, but when we arrive in 5 years time, we will realize we have lost out. As it is, don't forget that our regional peers, Indonesia is one slumbering giant which is just waking up. They are finding their sweet spot. And by the time they've already figured it out, we would have lost out. So I think continued investments, especially Malaysia being geographically so crucial, I think we should continue to invest in the long-term projects like what you have mentioned, but managing the current what Mr. Surendran calls the headwinds, the local headwinds, that I think should be a short-term measure. Like how we are done for AP, I mentioned that earlier, right? So what we've done for AP, we manage the AP, but we don't continue the subsidy forever, because by 5 years time, everybody would have forgotten why we started the AP. Nobody even would remember Russia and Ukraine war. They'll think they did the AP because the elections were around the corner. That's exactly what many people will believe. So we should continue to invest in the future. If not, as a nation, I think we will lose out. That's really what I think so, right? And we leave the facing and the budgeting to the Ministry of Finance, but they shouldn't stop, right? You take a healthcare, for example, right? So we come back to another thing. If not for our healthcare system, I think we would have had more debts than we already have, because our healthcare system was able to sustain, despite the fact that our healthcare system is completely subsidized, 99.9% subsidized. We spend $36 billion every year on the budget. I think if not for that healthcare system, we would have had what some of these very developed countries like Spain had, mortuaries in the stadium. We only did that for a few days, maybe a couple of weeks in Selayang and a few places where we had to have this containers being used as mortuaries. Otherwise, we did very well. If not for that long-term investment, we would have gone down the same path that India or Spain or Italy went down, right? So I think long-term investments cannot be traded off.
Right. Thank you. Perhaps the next questions from the floor.
Thank you for the insightful discussion, panelists. My question is a rather simple one, and it is posed to Dr. Kumaraja. How does ESG play a role in the Malaysia's economic development? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. For your information, Economic Planning Unit is the focal point for SDG. Okay, so SDG, what will be important will be, we have the 17 goals altogether, the Sustainable Development Goals, and then the SDG 8 that you mentioned. It's not only SDG 8. Department of Statistics Malaysia, DOSM, they are also monitoring each SDG, the indicators of each SDGs. And in terms of EPU, our minister is actually chairing one committee called the SDG Circle. Okay, so we are also monitoring in terms of the SDG, all the SDGs, not only SDG 8, but we also monitor all the SDGs, okay, the 17 goals, the indicators under the 17 goals. And then we also, apart from the SDG Circle, we also have what we call a parliamentarian group, whereby they also discussed about, what are the issues and challenges that Malaysia faces right now, because we have to report this back to the United Nations. So there will be a meeting in United Nations which we need to report this, what are the steps that we have taken, what are the measures that have been put in place, and how are we measuring those indicators. That is the most important thing. Perhaps I would have answered your question. Thank you. Please, Doctor.
Just to add on other things, right? So I think that whole ESG story, right? Yes. I think the whole ESG story is something, again, Malaysia is in a very good position, because if you look at issues, we have a lot of issues, from the RSPO in terms of our sustainability on our palm oil. I mean, if you look at the European narrative that we are killing more orangutans simply to make sure that we can earn more money from palm oil, that narrative we have not very successfully been able to counter yet. But if we just use the same tool that the Western world is using against us, and I think if we bring back the ESG narrative to our commodities, we bring back the ESG narrative to even say where we have a huge advantage, Sukuk financing, the Islamic financing story. So as a country, right? So we lose out to Singapore when you talk about conventional financing, because Singapore, after London and Dubai, probably becomes the largest financial hub in parts of Asia, even after Hong Kong. But we don't have that ability. But why not? We have a very strong Islamic finance story. We have a very strong Islamic finance institutions. We have a few banks. Actually, we are probably, after London, if I'm not mistaken, we have the second largest sukuk hub in the world. We have, in fact, some of the largest sukuk issues. We can bring that ESG story to sustainable financing and bring that to our capital markets, to our financing, to our products, commodities, and that SDG again is one of our strongest points. We just need to harness it. We, on the other hand, being Malaysians, we are nice people. We don't shout about the good things that we do, whereas the rest of the world, all they do is just one simple thing, but then the way they sell, obviously the world is based on perception, not reality. Nobody is interested in reality, but the perception game, others win, we don't. I think that's what we should probably bring back. And ESG, like you mentioned, I think very good question. If we bring back ESG, that alone will be one very unique selling proposition. Yes, we are the second largest palm oil producer, Mr. Surendran mentioned, after Indonesia. But if we can get our big palm oil companies, Saimdabi, IOI, KL Kepong, all these big players, Falda, to become RSPO faster than Indonesia, I don't see why somebody in Europe will not buy from us, right? And then we say, let's go and sell to India. Fine. But how much more India can consume? And don't forget, when the 400 million middle class population in India becomes more affluent, they won't eat palm oil. They will go into more higher oil, like olive oil, right? So we can't afford it, we don't do it. But when they can afford it, they'll do. And that time our market will start dropping again. So I think we have a very good story in ESG.
Thank you, members of the audience and the panelists, for taking and answering the questions. On that note, we've had a very engaging, focused and forward-looking discussion. As a trading nation, Malaysia is committed to forging a vibrant, sustainable and highly resilient economy that is integrated with the global economy. Therefore, we believe that this objective can only be achieved by working hand in hand based on the principles of mutually beneficial cooperation. With that, we have come to the end of our session today. Thank you so much to our panelists today for the insightful discussion. Thank you and have a pleasant afternoon.